In the dark and freezing December of 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread that was fraying with every passing hour. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but the Blitz was raging in the streets. London was burning. The Luftwaffe was pounding the industrial heartlands of Coventry and Liverpool. On the map of the world, the British Empire still looked vast, a splash of pink covering a quarter of the globe. But inside the war rooms of Whittle, the men who ran the British government knew a terrifying secret that they dared not whisper to the public. The empire was not just bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding to death financially. Winston Churchill sat at his desk in the underground cabinet war rooms to write one of the most important letters of his life, addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. Churchill was a master of language, a man who could turn a phrase into a weapon. But in this letter, he had to perform a humiliating dance. He had to tell the leader of the world as richest neutral nation, that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, the empire that defeated Napoleon, was completely and utterly broke. The letter described the U-boat peril, the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the sting was in the tail. Churchill wrote that the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies it needed to survive. The British people would fight on the beaches, but they could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. It was a plea for survival, an admission of insolvency. When war began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial titan, billions in gold reserves, massive overseas investments, railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, industrial concerns in the United States. The city of London was the hub of global finance. But the war Hitler launched was different. It was a war of machines, consuming steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at rates that defied all calculations, and crucially, Britain had to import almost everything. The blockade meant Britain could no longer trade with Europe. It had to look across the Atlantic for survival. But the United States was officially neutral. The American public was isolationist, determined not to repeat World War I. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts with a specific clause, cash and carry. Britain could buy American supplies, but had to pay in cash immediately and transport them on their own ships. No loans, no credit. The Americans demanded gold on the barrelhead before the crates left New York. For the first year, Britain drained its treasury. They liquidated gold reserves. In Operation Fish, the British government loaded the entire gold wealth of the nation onto battleships and shipped it across the dangerous Atlantic to Canadian vaults. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. Billions in gold bars sent into exile to pay American bill collectors. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The liquid cash was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington had contracts it couldn't sign, because Treasury officials in London said there were no dollars left. When Roosevelt received Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes. If Britain fell, America would be next. But he faced a political problem. He couldn't simply give money to Britain. American laws forbade it, and the public would be outraged. He needed it to look like a business deal, not charity. This is where Lend-Lease was born. Roosevelt explained it with a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You lend it and get it back when the fire's out. It sounded generous, neighborly. But the reality behind closed doors was entirely different. It wasn't a conversation between neighbors. It was a foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. Henry Morgenthau Jr., head of the American Treasury, was a staunch anti-fascist who wanted to help Britain. But he was also guardian of the American taxpayer. He believed before the U.S. gave a single dime, Britain must prove it had stripped itself of every last asset. Morgenthau demanded a full audit of the British Empire, every asset owned by the government and private citizens worldwide. The British negotiators were stunned. They were being treated not as an ally, but as a failed company in receivership. Sir Frederick Phillips tried to argue. Britain had already sold its gold. Selling long-term investments mid-war would be a fire sale, pennies on the dollar. Stripping Britain of overseas income would leave it destitute after the war. Morgenthau was unmoved. His instructions were clear. No aid until Britain scraped the bottom of the barrel. If Britain still had U.S. assets, Why should Iowa farmers pay for British tanks? The most painful symbol was American Viscose Corporation, the largest rain manufacturer in America, owned by British company Courtaulds, a jewel generating millions annually in dividends to London. Morgenthau targeted it. He told the British they had to sell. The cash would go to the U.S. Treasury for weapon orders. The British resisted. The company was worth over $100 million. A rushed wartime sale would be suicide, but Morgenthau held the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was in Congress. Isolationists were attacking it, claiming Britain was rich and tricking America. Morgenthau needed proof Britain was bleeding. His ultimatum: sell American viscose or Lend-Lease dies. On March 15, 1941, under Washington's pressure, Britain seized American viscose from its owners, a compulsory purchase under emergency war powers, because the sale was distressed. American bankers drove a merciless bargain. Sold for roughly $50 million, it was theft, worth at least double. Britain had to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds while the dollars went straight to the U.S. Treasury. This was the turning point. The British elite realized the true price of the special relationship. They weren't partners. They were being stripped to pay for survival. The United States was absorbing the empire's wealth, not by conquest, but by contract. But it wasn't just industrial assets. While negotiators argued over stock prices, another deal was being cut involving the Royal Navy. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers. World War I-era ships sitting in American mothballs, obsolete and rusting. Roosevelt agreed. But there was a price. He traded them in exchange for 50 rusting ships. America demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Atlantic, from Newfoundland to the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Britain gave America a strategic footprint covering the entire Western Hemisphere, the keys to the Caribbean and North Atlantic, bases that would project American power for a century, all for 50 barely seaworthy ships, a geopolitical fire sale. Britain trading long-term assets for short-term survival. By March 1941, when Lend-Lease was signed into law, Britain had been stripped clean, gold gone, investments sold, bases leased, treasury empty. The act was hailed as the arsenal of democracy, and it provided tanks, planes, oil, and food that kept Britain alive. Without it, the Nazis would have starved the British Isles. But the financial terms laid groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be debtor and America creditor. The Lend-Lease text contained Article 7, a small paragraph in dense diplomatic language. But it held a poison pill. In return for aid, Britain would dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. This was the economic wall holding the empire together, a tariff system favoring trade between Britain and its colonies. It meant British goods were cheaper in empire markets than American goods. It allowed British industry to survive against more efficient American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to tear down its own economic defenses, open the empire to American exporters, sign the death warrant of their trading bloc. British negotiators fought it. They knew it meant the end of empire as an economic unit. But they had no choice. German bombers overhead, U-boats in the Atlantic, cash gone. They signed. After Pearl Harbor, Britain and America fought side by side. American soldiers poured into Britain. But the financial disparity only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded. The U.S. economy grew massively every year. Britain's economy was cannibalized by the war effort. Britain stopped exporting, converted every factory to war production, abandoned markets in Latin America and Asia. Who stepped into those markets? American companies. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for global markets. America was fighting the war while stealing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer was absolute. World gold reserves moved from London to Fort Knox. Financial gravity shifted across the Atlantic. The British believed their sacrifice would be honored. They'd fought alone for 2 years, bankrupted themselves to save the world. They believed Lend-Lease would continue, allowing transition time. They were wrong. They'd forgotten the viscose lesson. In high finance, gratitude isn't currency. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Pure joy. The empire had stood alone against darkness and prevailed. But in Washington, there was no sentimentality, only a cold bureaucratic machine waiting for this moment. 7 days after victory celebrations, President Truman signed a paper that would devastate Britain's economy more than any German bomb. He terminated Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal and immediate. All aid stopped, no transition, no grace period. In the Atlantic, American ships loaded with wheat and meat bound for Liverpool were ordered to turn around. The lifeline was severed. The British government was paralyzed. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, looked at the numbers and saw the abyss. Britain imported half its food and almost all raw materials, paid with Lend-Lease dollars. Without them, Britain was instantly bankrupt. Keynes calculated Britain faced a financial Dunkirk, default on payments, stop importing food, cut rations to starvation levels, mass unemployment, social collapse, only one option. Britain had to beg. September 1945. A dying Keynes boarded a ship for Washington, sick, exhausted, suffering from a fatal heart condition. The greatest economic mind of the century, going not as an intellectual but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. Britain fought alone for 2 years while America stayed neutral, sacrificed its entire economy to save civilization. Therefore, America should give Britain a gift, a grant, $6 billion. Not a loan, but retroactive payment for holding the line. He called it justice. But in Washington, justice wasn't recognized currency. The war was over. Americans were tired of paying for Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, elected on socialism and nationalization. They wouldn't use capitalist tax dollars for a British socialist experiment. American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were hard-faced. They told Keynes bluntly, no gift, no grant, only a loan on commercial terms with interest. Keynes was devastated. He argued, pleaded, warned them that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally against the Soviet threat. But Americans held all cards. They knew Britain had nowhere else to go. They offered $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, with strings attached. Strings designed to strangle the last remnants of the empire's economic independence. The most poisonous, sterling convertibility. Within 1 year, Britain must make the pound fully convertible. Anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars. Americans framed it as free trade, but it was designed to break the sterling area. During war, Britain forced colonies to accept pounds but forbade exchanging them for dollars. This forced countries like India and Australia to buy British goods, a closed loop protecting British industry. Americans wanted to smash it. They knew if the pound became convertible, everyone would sell pounds to buy dollars. Everyone wanted American goods, not British. American cars, fridges, machines were better. Keynes knew this was a death trap. The moment convertibility was introduced, there'd be a run draining the loan in weeks. He fought until his health broke. But the alternative was starvation, reluctantly, bitterly. Parliament accepted. They called it a financial Munich, appeasing Americans to survive. The loan was signed July 1946. Keynes died months later, his heart giving out under the stress. But the tragedy was just beginning. Winter 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried Britain, coal froze, power stations shut, factories closed, people shivered in unheated homes. In this frozen darkness, reality came home. They'd won the war, but living standards were plummeting. Bread, never rationed even during the darkest U-boat days, was rationed in peacetime. The age of austerity had begun. Then the clock struck on the American condition. July 15, 1947. Britain made the pound fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes predicted: financial massacre. The world rushed to sell pounds. Countries stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it for US dollars. The American loan, supposed to last years, began evaporating. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions. The hemorrhage was violent. Reserves vanished. After just 5 weeks, August 20th, Britain suspended convertibility, slammed the windows shut. They went to the U.S. Treasury and admitted total failure, burned through a huge portion of the loan. For nothing, the humiliation was total. The empire tried to play by American rules and was crushed. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. February 1947, Britain sent a secret telegram to the State Department, a message of resignation. For a century, Britain guarded Greece and Turkey, keeping Russians from the Mediterranean. Now, with an empty treasury, Britain couldn't afford it. The telegram said, "We're broke. We're leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you do it." This triggered the Truman Doctrine. America stepped in to fill the vacuum. The formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower, just a regional power trying to keep lights on. 1949. With the economy stagnant and reserves low, Britain devalued the pound. Before war, £1 equals $4.86. In 1949, slashed to $2.80 overnight, British people became 30% poorer. But the final war bill wasn't just paid in the 1940s. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 wasn't a gift. It was commercial debt with interest every year for 6 decades. The British Treasury wrote checks to the U.S. Treasury through the 50s boom, 70s gloom, Thatcher years, Blair years. The payments continued. Final payment, December 29, 2006. Think about that. 60 years after the guns fell silent. 60 years after victory parades, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. The story of victory's price debunks the idea that wars have winners. In the modern era, total war is negative sum. Germany lost and was destroyed. Britain won and was bankrupted. The only winner, the United States. The U.S. economy doubled during war. Industry untouched by bombs. It held 2/3 of world gold. Through Lend-Lease and post-war loans, it dismantled the empire's trading preferences, opening global markets for American goods. America didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it, acquired the assets, bases, and geopolitical influence in a distressed sale managed by the U.S. Treasury. For the British, the legacy remained a national scar, a lingering sense of decline. The feeling that best days were past, it fueled a special relationship. Always a euphemism for dependency. When Churchill wrote that December 1940 letter to Roosevelt, he saved his country from Hitler. But he also signed the deed of sale. He traded the empire for survival, a deal that had to be made. No other choice. But the cost was the future. Britain emerged as a moral giant but economic pygmy. It spent its inheritance to buy Europe's freedom, the noblest sacrifice in history. But in the cold light of economics, it was a liquidation. The empire didn't fall. It was sold off piece by piece to pay the bill for doing the right thing. Subscribe now, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.